And that's also a major flaw with the communism kind of mindset. Okay, hi guys, welcome back to the second episode of the Fright Circuit. And here two theme that's like the space background, which is kind of foreshadowing the fact that we're going to be talking about the space race. I'm Vyom Gupta and I'm the president of the FSC Club. And with me is Aditya Agarwal.
Hi guys, like Vyom said, today we're going to be talking about the space race. If you remember from last episode, we stopped at around 1940, 1950. And the key thing that we highlighted at that period was the space race. And both of us are extremely passionate about the space race, but it's funny because we're passionate about two different parts. If you want to take them through like the two really cool parts we're interested in.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I'm actually really interested in the economics behind the space race. What was kind of like the cost and the benefits of this field? And we're going to kind of look at how this has kind of evolved from then in the 1960s. We're going to branch out and kind of entirely look at space exploration and how the economics has changed now and like how space has become something which has actually become profitable, especially with private companies entering. And the part that Aditya is really interested in is the policies. Like, how have the policies changed? How have they evolved? How it started out with this entirely kind of government-run thing, and how the government has kind of loosened the strings on this kind of sector and kind of let private players come in.
I just wanted to like highlight that the reason I care about this so much is because just like as a history student, you study like the Cold War, you study things, you study the intricacies of the Cold War, and the spaces actually was a large part of that. Like if you look at this, the softer power parts in the Cold War, the when the Sputnik was launched and the US's reaction to that, well, that is a really important part of history. And the way you look at the way I saw policymakers like react, and when I research, it's actually really fascinating. So I think this is going to be a really interesting episode.
Okay, so let's start off with what exactly was the space race.
Right. On the 4th of October, the world changed forever. In 1957, the Sputnik beeped over the Earth, signaling to the Soviet Union that it had successfully launched. And anybody who knows a remote amount of history knows that this was extremely instrumental in what was seemingly a parallel like a fight in the Cold War. Somehow the USSR had gotten an unbeatable edge. The US always thought they were ahead in the space program, but the USSR just went miles ahead when they signaled to the world that they had launched the first satellite in space. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It was like a kind of makeshift satellite. It was like this one ball, which was made out like of aluminum or something like of those kind of materials, and it had like these four antennas attached at the back. And the interesting thing was the Sputnik. This is really funny, but the Sputnik was not the most advanced satellite that they had. They had something that was much more advanced and something that was much more capable. If you go online and see pictures of Sputnik, it basically looks like a potato. Like jokes were made that
I've
it's
seen
called the
it, yeah.
Sputnik. Yeah, but this is also a point in space exploration where we hadn't found a way to develop enough thrust to kind of get something into orbit. So that's why in the payload capacity, we needed something that was small and like easily that could easily fit into uh that structure that was made for the specific payload. So that's why the Sputnik was actually like was a last minute makeshift satellite that was made, that was just like strung together with these kind of rough materials. And that's really cool because it kind of shows like this kind of urgency that was there in order to get something into orbit.
Like I was talking about the historical background of the Cold War, it's really interesting to note that the US before they just did not spend that much on the space race. Like it was important, but they were focused largely on the actual defense spending. But the day that Sputnik launched, the entire government in the US just went like crazy. And actually, within the same year, the budget for NASA, I think it became 4% of the US budget, which for context is extremely massive. Like no other, like even probably education barely has 4% of the budget. So to think about the fact that just because Sputnik got in space, the US set 4% of budget to get a satellite on in space, it's actually pretty crazy. We will take them through what happened when the satellite went in space, the first one.
Okay, yeah. So this was really funny, but there were like all kinds of rumors when the first satellite was in space. They thought that now they could spy over the entire US. They kind of overestimated how great the satellite was. And the funny thing about the satellite was like I think just 2 or 3 years, it because when you put something in orbit, especially at the like this was like in a really low Earth orbit. So what
Yeah.
happened was like the it was just above the common line, like 100 kilometers into space, and it was kind of interacting with the atmosphere of Earth. So that kind of grew on it, kind of slowed down the craft. There was a lot of like friction per se, and it kind of deorbited it. And people don't know this, but it deorbited in like 3 years.
So the year was 57, and like we've talked about so far, Sputnik just launched. What happened after that, Hume? Like, what did the US do in response?
Okay, so basically they had something known as Operation Vanguard, which was essentially what they wanted to do was also get a satellite into space, but I think it failed. Like they
Yeah, it was
weren't
pretty
able to
funny.
reach
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
Yeah. And then after that, what happened was you can kind of see this string of events where the USSR is kind of winning hands down. So we are looking at the USSR getting the first monkey into space. Then after that, they get the first dog, Luca, into space, which is like a really funny story. Very sadly, I think Luca passed away on re-entry because the rocket they had designed was not capable enough. And at this time, we can see like the USSR making the first kind of rockets which lasted them till now. Like we're seeing these rockets being used currently. Other than that, we also look at the first human going in space in 1961. And Aditya can tell us something special that happened just around this time.
Right.
In response, what the US did.
Right. In response to Sputnik, the US actually, like, not a lot of people know this, but the US is so far behind that NASA wasn't even created. So after the USSR sent their first satellite in space, the US created NASA in 58 just so they could like deal with this threat. But as probably most of your space enthusiasts, so like history enthusiasts would know, that in 60, uh, I think Kennedy, right? Yeah, Kennedy gave this really famous speech about the importance of about the symbolic importance of going to space and how this is a big commitment to the United States. And he assured the American people that really soon the United States is going to have a man on the moon. And this was extremely pivotal in terms of like government for America, because really suddenly for some reason we're going to talk about why the space race was a really important, the most important part of that anything that anybody would the most important thing that anybody would talk about in Washington. But also secondly, in terms of the budget, Vyom's going to tell you about this. The United States allocated 4% of their budget to NASA, which is unheard of. And this is at a time where defense was really important. This is at a time where just generally industry was doing really well. So, Vyom, what do you think is the symbolic importance so large that the United States government had to give 4% of their budget to the space race?
Okay, so that's the thing. It was very clearly a use of economics to kind of show geopolitical power, to show not only geopolitical power, to just show global dominance. We see these two major powers trying to show that they're the greatest. They're going off and fighting these different kind of wars in Vietnam, and then later I think Afghanistan comes way later, but that we see stuff going on there also, right? And
Yeah.
basically, we see them not we see them kind of shifting like their budget in kind of uh to display not only like power in terms of like military power, but now this is where kind of soft power comes in, where they're kind of spending like how you said 4% of their budget on rockets.
And this is really funny, right? That pivot from Project Vanguard was this huge, spectacular display of power, which failed, but eventually they were pretty successful. And note that the Sputnik, even though the Soviet Union is made fun of the inefficient, bad use of economy, things like that, they only spent $5 million to launch Sputnik. 8 years later, when Apollo went into orbit, the US actually spent like north of $25 million to achieve the same result. So this is actually really funny because it shows us that even though now we think of the Soviet Union as failing, science was bad, things like that, they actually did a pretty good job of handling their resources well. Because the United States, who still is and was at the time the forefront at the cutting edge of all technology, they have to spend 5 times of what the Soviet Union had to spend. And this is a really important part in terms of like economics and what we were going to discuss about how economical the space race was.
Actually, to add on to the point you were talking about, which is like more policy and like not policy, but like economics related. Which basically we're kind of looking at like how you were saying it was more efficient. We can kind of look at like how they were two kind of different economic systems. So we're kind of looking at like a capitalism versus communism here, and we're seeing that initially communism clearly had this kind of head start where they were able to allocate their resources efficiently to get it done in like this kind of much smaller cost, which is like $5 million. And we're kind of looking at the US spending like these large amounts of money, that even though communism had like a steady start and something that it seemed like it was hands down winning, especially when it comes to technology, in terms of all kinds of technology, even like when we started looking at aeroplanes, with the Comac and like the Tupolev, we could see initially like communism seemed to be quite ahead in terms of any kinds of technological advancement. We eventually start seeing like towards the end of 1969 with the touchdown of Apollo on the moon and stuff like that, that it seems like the tables had turned and capitalism was so slowly winning.
Right. And obviously, since Vyom said, and I just want to build upon this further, that regardless of how it seemed in the start, the United States finally did start doing what the United States does best, and that's like just dominating the world in everything, especially the space race. So you might think like where did all that money go from the budget? And the money was actually used pretty well because even though they were losing out in the start, they did a lot. Like in within 10 years, I think they got 6 landings on the moon. There were 12 astronauts that walked on the moon, which is hands down beat the Soviet Union. They couldn't reach those kind of numbers.
Another thing is when we start talking about Apollo, uh, the very interesting aspect is that basically the first mission was very successful,
Yeah,
but then all of us know about Apollo 13, right? Apollo, there was Apollo 11, which was the first one which was successful. Before that, there was
right.
8, 9, 10, which kind of did these orbits around the moon. And then Apollo 13, which is a very important part of kind of overcoming some kind of problem and kind of progressing in the space race. For the
So we've talked a lot about like the USSR, the USSR, the US and the USSR, the space race, what it was in the 60s. We understood how successful Sputnik Apollo 13 were, Apollo 11 were. But now there's something actually pivotal that happened in the midst of all of this tension, in the peak of the Cold War. Actually, the humanity did something that actually pretty infamous for. They reached a diplomatic solution.
talking about the treaty, it was very significant and very cool. It was the founding of the ISS. So essentially, what happened was there was the Apollo craft which had been taking men to the moon, and the Soyuz craft, which was one of the first, well, I think was the first kind of spacecraft to take people in orbit, and I
Right,
think it carried a man Yuri Gagarin to his first low Earth orbit. So we're essentially looking at the forefront of the USSR technology and the forefront of the US technology coming together, and they basically did something which is known as rendezvous and docking, which is basically they met in low Earth orbit around the Earth, and the most interesting part was like they had two separate docking systems. So the scientists had to collaborate and find a way to essentially make these two rockets hold hands, which was so significant and something so interesting, which kind of shows these two systems of
right,
combining. And it was like the first bridge that was connected between the East and the West, which was something very significant. And
right. But if
if you want to
I,
add more on that.
right. Yeah, I just want to note one thing that it is, while to just an observer, it does look like, wow, these people are finally collaborating. There is a little less tension. This is great. Obviously, there was an ulterior motive in this, and there were actually two problems. Firstly, that both of them realized that they were just spending crazy amounts on like the space
Oh.
race for nothing. And sure, it's symbolically important, and obviously now today there is a lot of implications that we're going to talk about. But I think back then both of them had a conversation probably, and it was something like both of us need to reduce our spending, and we need to really like tone it down, otherwise it's going to become a real problem. So, and like policymakers have done a lot of research about this, and you see that the outer space treaty was hidden with like no militarization zones in speech, and basically the idea was that they want to prevent like mutually assured destruction. Yeah. like mad. As you know, this is a problem now with like nuclear missiles. But back then, the trouble was that space is going to become extremely weaponized by these two powers, and every other country on the United Nations was just like, you need to stop weaponizing space because otherwise this is going to become a problem because none of us can compete. And now, as we know with nukes, is that if one person does the wrong thing, then the entire world is just jeopardized. So that was the actual like policy sentiment behind the Outer Space Treaty. But the Outer Space Treaty,
And
as you would talk about the Moon Treaty, like how it disastrously failed.
no, no, okay, yeah, sure. No, I just want to add one point which is very
Yeah.
interesting here, which I feel also has like implications like in today's world also. Is basically they were reaching too far for their time. They were trying to kind of do this phenomenal thing and spend large amounts of money when especially not exactly the US but the USSR had kind of people struggling in their economy. So there were people who were not getting enough food and they were dying. So it's basically kind of showing us that how you can kind of totally be on the wrong track, how economies can totally be on the wrong track. And sometimes you just need to take a back step and you need kind of this kind of collaboration between two powers to kind of realize what you're doing is wrong and kind of backtrack and start working on something that can lead you to a time in the future where you can come back and look at it. Because if you, because and why I feel this is really essential is if you look at the moon landing, which happened in the 1960s, 1969, 1970s, we have not looked at something like that for the next 50 years, which is insane. Like we were that ahead of our time. And that kind of shows that how resources need to be allocated. Like you can't be like it brings up two things. One, it brings up the problem of technology. Like, should we have just gone ahead and then started getting people to Mars? Was that something that we should have done at that time? Or then started looking at other problems in the economy which were not being looked at, especially even in the US, where they had to start spending or allocating resources in kind of other dimensions.
That's a really good quote, like highlight what Vyog was saying. That one of, I'm forgetting the name, but one of the key like leaders in the field at the time said that it wasn't love the outer space treaty. It wasn't love for the sake of peace. It was out of fear for chaos. That actually epitomizes what they were
Wow.
doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just to wrap up before we move to our next episode, where we're going to look at space race and the space race and how it exists in the modern landscape. There are a few things that the Outer Space Treaty didn't include, which is kind of foreshadowing at what is to come. Is that firstly, private actors weren't mentioned at all in the Outer Space Treaty. And when you look at companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin, it really makes us question what all they can do and what all they will be able to do in the future, especially now that there are such heavy amounts of like collaboration with NASA and SpaceX and like down the line, even maybe ISRO and private Indian space companies.
Yeah, and as an Indian, I was just going to say, like, as an Indian, I feel it's essential that we mention some of the private companies here, like Skyroot, which are based off Hyderabad and doing an excellent job.
As we transition to how the space race exists today, there are a lot of more relevant people. Just the Outer Space Treaty went from just 3, 4 signatories to 110 countries signing it today, which is actually a pretty impressive number, considering like the largest countries haven't signed the most basic agreements, like even the Declaration of Human Rights. So getting 110 countries to sign the Outer Space Treaty is a large achievement that humanity should definitely be proud of. But today, India, China, the US, USSR, a lot like the UK. These are all countries that actually, in their own way, they're trying to compete again in a way, not in as aggressive as a space race, but in terms of like maybe not military use, but in terms of reconnaissance, in terms of space mining, some say, in terms of setting up bases on the moon, like the space is becoming increasingly important for soft power, and it's drawing kind of chilly parallels. It's kind of drawing chilly parallels into what the landscape was in around 1960, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out.
Okay, so concluding thoughts are very simple. I really hope that some of you are watching this video when you'll grow up. Hopefully, you'll are like our age, around our age. In the next 20 years, you will go ahead and kind of make leaping steps or in space exploration. And for all of y'all who are currently not looking at that and kind of thinking narrower, kind of looking down on Earth, on other kind of uh, I don't know, uh, other kind of engineering or physics problems. I just have like one thing to tell you all, like keep one eye on the stars and like always kind of look up and be thinking of what is going to happen in the next 20 years. Because whether you like it or not, I truly feel that a major part of our future is going to be up there.
Right. I mean, we talked about this in our first episode. I think it's a recurring theme that humanity's always looked up at the stars and been like, there must be something there, and they've always wanted to build like empires when they look at the
Yeah.
stars, and that's been a driving force for all of humanity. And I think that it's really interesting that it always brings us back to that. So we're going to talk about this again in our next episode, but I think thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.
Yeah. Bye, guys.